Okay, Wendell, we know that you were born in Chicago and grew up in Chicago through much of your early life, but your family actually migrated to Chicago from the South, from New Orleans. Tell me about the MacNeals in New Orleans.
The MacNeals to New Orleans. Well, the family migration came about in the middle 20s, I think. That's when, at that time in history, the black population were coming north, what they call Freedom Land, and for bigger opportunities for work and education. And that's when my family migrated to Chicago, and that's where I was born.
But prior to that, prior to the migration, tell me about the MacNeals in New Orleans. I mean, you have quite a history there.
My grandfather, Wendell, I guess he'd be considered the first because I'm the third, and my son is the fourth, and his son is the fifth, so there are five of us. My grandfather was a musician, and little did I know that he was quite a famous musician at the time, because as I saw and knew my grandfather, he was always an old man. And I knew he liked opera because we had to visit him once a week, sit down, and he made us listen to opera while he smoked his stinky pipe and drank Madeira wine. So, but he was a very active musician. He belonged to Paul Robichaud's dance band and orchestra. And
what did he play?
My grandfather played a number of instruments. He played the violin, he played the French horn, he played the viola, and all of his children, my aunts and uncles, were required to play an instrument. But anyway, at the time of his youth, he and his brother James were, I guess you'd call, mildly famous musicians in New Orleans.
You found out about that. Well, I'm sure you knew about it, but you and Bernie visited New Orleans a couple of years ago, or a few years back, and were treated to quite a surprise presentation at a college there.
Tulane University. And we visited there, prearranged, because I have a cousin that still lives in New Orleans, and she had contacted him about the family history, and he had laid out on a huge table pictures, press clippings, and all sorts of memorabilia about my grandfather, his brother, and their musical career. I mean, it was unbelievable. The flattery that I read, the things that were so important at that time in the musical instruments that he had accomplished. But
I've always felt that New Orleans was an interesting city, and I judge it from afar because I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. There was a rich, yes, it's in the South, and we know what all of that is about, but also there's a rich musical history there. I think there always has been, and it must be the culture, because there's a wonderful blend of music down there.
Oh, there certainly is, and there's still a blend of music.
Yes.
But back then, in the beginning 1800s,
right.
Black musicians were plentiful, but hardly used in white establishments.
Right.
And you had people like Kid Ory and Satchmo and people of that ilk. But the music was just plentiful. My grandfather, one of my interesting times in my life is when my grandfather would tell what my grandmother considered his lies. Of course, I didn't believe they were lies. They were just so absolutely entertaining. When he worked on the river boats in the Mississippi, also in the houses of ill repute.
Aha.
Funny stories. May I tell you a story?
Certainly.
He worked in a place called, I think, Madame Tussauds Parlor or whatever. Anyway, the gentlemen callers would come in, and it was quite a plush place, according to him. And they had a game that they played called Kick the Ham.
Kick the Ham.
Kick the Ham. Now you have to visualize this. These plush settees and couches in this big anteroom, and the gentlemen callers would come in with their walking canes and derbies and top hats and cigars. And they would require the attendance of the ladies of the evening. So they would all come out. And my grandfather was playing the piano at the time in this particular place. And they had this ham that was extended from the ceiling. Big ham on a golden chain. And he'd start playing, and the gentlemen callers would be sitting around just as we're doing. And the ladies would come out and dance and kick the ham. And of course, they had no underwear on.
Oh.
So you looked at these ladies with a great deal of scrutiny and decided who you wanted to share your evening with by how high they kicked the leg and what they saw. So the ladies would be accompanied by my grandfather playing the music, and they're kicking the ham, and the gentleman would say, "Ah, mon chéri, good evening," and then they would go off and seek pleasure. That's what my grandmother said was a bunch of lies, but I knew that was true.
Well, let's get to I'll tell you what. Let's get to Chicago. Where did you live in Chicago?
I lived on the south side.
That's a famous area of Chicago.
Well, it's a famous area, and unfortunately, it's notorious at this
Yeah.
particular time. But I lived on the south side, which was predominantly a black community, because we lived in a black community because, believe it or not, I am black, African American. And it was an education in and of itself because we only knew what our family imparted to us in terms of class, status, and my family from New Orleans was a classy family, a family of some notoriety musically. And
what kind of jobs did they get? Did your family get when they moved north? I didn't mean to interrupt you, I'm sorry.
My grandfather had been a teacher at a college, believe it or not.
Really?
He taught at a university that's now called Dillard. It's a black university. And apparently they were not paying a good salary, so his family took part in the big migration.
Sure.
And he left that teaching position at the college to come to Chicago, and as my recollection goes, he actually worked in the post office.
I see.
Which paid a pretty good salary at
Sure.
the time for black men, that in the railroad. So he worked there for many years, and I knew him probably just before he retired, because I was very young at the time.
Yeah.
And he had been in Chicago because my father was a grown man, obviously. But he worked in the post office for many years.
Tell me about your family. Brothers and sisters?
I'm the oldest of 8.
Oldest of 8.
Oldest of 8. 5 boys, 3 girls. And our forces are diminishing now because we've lost a few.
Sure.
But oldest of 8, had a lot of fun growing up. I left at a very early age. And
Before you left, growing up in Chicago, I mean, this is a northern city, but
Yeah.
still, you lived in basically a black section of that city. Were there places in Chicago that you could go or couldn't go? Were there boundaries? Were there limitations?
Absolutely,
Were there?
absolutely. The North Side was notorious for its segregation, and black people had pockets in Chicago where we live. Morgan Park is the community that I lived in. It was way out south
I
of
see.
Chicago. The North Side of Chicago was predominantly white, as was the West and the East.
Sure.
But we had pockets of development, if you will, and we lived in the extreme South Side,
I see.
which was a big pocket in the black community.
Could you, and maybe you did, stumble by accident into the wrong area and were told to get out or something like that?
We didn't stumble, we knew where to go.
Oh,
Although I've had several very unfortunate experiences in Chicago. I was an avid tennis player as a kid, and I went to a park called Tulane Park, which was right across the boundary from my community. And they were giving tennis lessons, so a buddy of mine decided we'd go and take this lesson. It was open to the public. So we went into this big gymnasium, and I remember this vividly.
how old were you?
I must have been 14, 15,
Okay.
something in that, teenager. And we went into the gym to take this lesson, and we took the lesson. And there was a lot of kids in there. We were the only two black kids. Me, not so obvious, but my buddy, yes. So we played tennis, took the lesson, and at the end of the lesson, we walked out. We opened the door, and I'd never seen so many people, white people in my life, gathered to create havoc.
Really?
They found out that there were two, and I don't want to use the word, two ends in the gym.
Correct.
And they were waiting for us, shouting terrible racial epithets.
Oh, wow.
And as we walked down the steps going out to the sidewalk to go across the line, they were throwing rocks and pushing us.
Nice.
One guy took my tennis racket. I lost my tennis racket.
Did you?
Took my tennis racket and chased us out of the neighborhood.
Well, unfortunately, that was America.
Oh, at the
that
time, that was.
Let's get back to your family. Tell me about your mom. Was she there? Your mother around?
Oh, sure. My
Yeah.
mother was there.
She was a homemaker.
Oh, she was a homemaker, but actually my grandmother was the driving force in my home. My mother was a wonderful little lady, and I say little because she was a beautiful lady. And you have to understand that my mother had 10 kids, and I remember her as always being pregnant.
Oh,
Always being pregnant. I never knew my mother when she wasn't pregnant.
I'll be darned.
And I'm sure that was one of the things that contributed to her demise,
Mm-hmm.
having so many kids. But my grandmother, her mother, was the driving force in the house. We called her Mama. And everybody knew Mama,
Yeah.
you know. And when Mama said something, you listened and you did. Because my mother was always in failing health.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she was the dominant factor, and she was a wonderful woman. And her mother and father were slaves.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
and from New Orleans.
Yeah.
Well, New Orleans, Virginia, in that area.
Yeah. What about your father? Your dad?
What about him?
Was he around? Was he?
Oh, yeah. My father was well, you know, I tell this story to people, and I don't know if they believe it. My father was a gangster at one point,
Okay.
and that's an interesting story because I say he's a gangster, and everybody drives all these wonderful stories. He worked for two guys in Chicago called the Jones Boys. The Jones Boys were brothers, and they were the two black mafia-like people who were in crime, and they ran illegal betting facilities,
Numbers yeah.
policy. They
Policy.
dealt with the horse races and that sort of thing. And he was high up in their hierarchy of people. And because I remember my father so vividly wearing Homburg hats, white silk scarves
Whoa.
with WPM on it, red silk ties with diamond pins. And we had a Pierce Arrow. You know what that is?
Yes, that was a very fine automobile back in the day.
ever.
One of the best.
And I remember riding in that car. And we had this huge house on the south side of Chicago,
Mhm.
but it was like a three-story mini mansion at that time.
Wow.
And I remember it was on Wabash Avenue, which was a very, very select section of the black community
I see.
on the south side. Anyway, we shared that, and I was a little guy then, you know, and we shared that bit of notoriety and wealth at the time. Until my father got a little greedy, I guess, and he used to collect money from the various houses, policy houses and number houses. $50, $60, $80, $100,000 a day he'd go pick up. And he got greedy once and didn't turn the money in and left. And I was only aware that my father wasn't there because he was always there, you know, because I used to ride with him. He used to take me to these places. One famous place was an ice cream parlor. And I'd go in and have ice cream, but that back door you go through was laden with telephones, tables, big charts with all the national horse racing.
All the horse racing going on.
Washington Park, Hialeah.
Lincoln Park, whatever, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, I went back and looked at all this stuff, and come back and eat my ice cream. But my dad at that time, he did do that. He took the money, went to New Orleans, went back to New Orleans, and they caught him there. And they were not good to him.
They were not good to him.
No, they put him in the hospital, and he almost died. So the only reason why they didn't kill him was that Ed Jones was in love with my mother. It was never an active affair, but that's what he said.
No.
That's the word that I got. So anyway, we went through a very difficult time at that point
Now,
because our income was cut off.
I'm probably changing the subject and jumping ahead
Sure.
here, but you have an uncle named Cab Calloway.
Yes.
Fine performer. And you eventually sort of moved in with him, as I
not a matter
understand
of
it.
move,
Tell
yeah.
me about that. How'd that
Okay.
work out?
I was in Chicago again. I was about 16, I guess, because I just quit high school. I got bored,
Oh,
and I quit high school. And being the oldest of 8, I wanted things that I didn't have, and thought I'd just work and get some clothes. I was a clothes horse, and I saw the other kids dressing so well, and we couldn't afford to have that. You know?
sure.
So anyway, my aunt is married to Cab, my father's sister,
Was married to Cab.
Cab, and I was the first grandchild, and he came to Chicago, and my aunt would say, "Where's Winnie?" That's me. They called me. All of us Wendells were called Winnie.
Winnie?
Winnie.
Okay.
And my aunt said, "Well, where's little Winnie?" That was me. And so I'd go visit her, and she'd take me out to dinner, to the movie. And at that point, she came to Chicago. I had quit high school. And she said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "What do you mean, nothing? What are you doing in school?" "Nothing, I quit." She did not like that. She said, "Okay, I tell you what." She said, "Your uncle has just bought a brand new car, a 1942 Chrysler." She said, "And your uncle's got to drive this to New York. Would you like to go with him?" I said, "Fine, help him drive." Now, I didn't even know how to drive. I learned how to drive trip from Chicago to
On the
New York,
road.
On the road. And I said, yes. So we went. I went with them, and I went with him. We drove the car to New York, Long Beach, New York, and we got there. She said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I guess I'll go back home." "And do what?" I said, "Go find a job." She said, "I'll give you an opportunity to do something different." She said, "You can go out with your uncle on the road and travel with him. And when you finish traveling, you decide what you want to do with your life." So I went out on the road with the band.
What'd you do?
Band boy, roadie.
A roadie.
Yes, there were 3 of us. I set up the band and all the different stops. And anyway, I did that for well over a year. Traveled all over the country, went to Cuba, lived the life, got an education worth $10 million as a 16-year-old in show business. And people, at that time, it was not unusual to have Nat Cole at the house, Duke Ellington.
Really?
All these famous black entertainers were contemporaries of Cab.
Sure.
So, and I was always, and Lena Horne was my aunt's closest friend. I can't tell you how many times I've been to her house, and she, would come to our place.
Was she as pretty in real life as she was on the screen?
Absolutely.
She was a beautiful woman.
Absolutely. Got many stories that I could tell you about that, but I'm sure you got other questions.
Sure.
But anyway, I traveled with him, and after, about a year and a half, 2 years of that, my aunt said, "Okay, it's time for you to make a decision." She said, "You're not going out on any more road trips with your uncle." Because he was getting ready to do maybe Porgy and Bess, and he was not traveling as much.
Right.
She said, "You can go back home or you can go back to school." School, oh my God, what do I want to go? After the experiences and the education I had traveling in show business, I couldn't conceive going back to high school,
Correct.
but I did.
Did you?
I did.
She was a strong influence on your life.
Absolutely. A major influence.
Yes.
She was responsible for me to getting all the education I got from that point on. Wow. So anyway, I did that, so that I went back to high school and college and the whole education.
Did you go right from high school to college?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, were you performing at that time?
Oh, yes. When I came off I've always been able to sing.
I see.
And in all of the high schools that I had attended, I was in the choir. And in my last high school in Baltimore, where Cab is from, and the Callaways are famous, I became kind of infamous, if you will, because they knew I finished up high school in Baltimore.
In Baltimore,
yeah. And they knew that I was Cab's nephew. And there was a group of kids guys that followed me around for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and I thought they wanted trouble.
Yeah.
And so one day I just stopped them after school and said, "What do you guys want?" So the guy said, "Man, do you sing?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, would you like to be in our group?" And I thought they were following me to beat me up.
Or something like that, sure.
And from that point on, and that was a very popular singing group in that high school. Mm-hmm. So I got in that group, and we became famous in that little community in that high school.
Did you sing outside of the high school too, as a group? Or
oh, sure.
Yeah. Did you get money for it?
Absolutely.
Oh, right.
Absolutely. In fact, we performed at the local black theater where if you were a black musician or famous, Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie,
sure,
you'd come to this theater called the Royal. That's where I first met Billie Holiday.
Billie Holiday.
I mean, that's a whole nother story. We were on the same bill. We were high school kids that was famous in Baltimore because of our notoriety and singing ability. Mm-hmm. And we were on the same bill with Billie Holiday. We went on and did our thing, came off, and she was supposed to go on. And she was stoned out of her mind.
Yeah.
Out of her mind.
She had a tough life, difficult life.
She did, and she pulled up her dress, showed her ass, and said, "Kiss my ass, I'm not going to do anything."
Oh,
and she did. And that was my introduction to Billie Holiday. And she never did anything. I don't know what they did. I think whatever other acts followed, they put on.
Sure.
But that was my... Mm-hmm. And we played in a number of clubs in Baltimore, segregated clubs. We played in one club called the Chantel. And I remember this distinctly because we were performing, 5 of us. And we were good, and we were young, and we were energetic.
Sure.
And people in the audience loved us. And apparently one of the white ladies winked at one of the guys in the group or something, because as we went off, we were back in the kitchen. The guy came back and said, "You guys got to get out of here." I said, "Why? What's the matter?" He said, "Well, somebody saw that one of your guys flirting with this white lady." And that was not true.
Wow.
That was not true.
Wow.
So anyway, we left without getting paid. I've been on the road, that's a whole nother story.
Where was it? Was it
in
Mississippi?
Atlanta, the first time the first time maybe, anyway, it was in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, we were traveling. I was with a company, Louisa's company. I'll tell you about my
Oh,
friend.
really?
Yeah. We were doing a show. Anyway, we were doing one-nighters, and we had come from some other place to Atlanta because we had a gig the next day. And we had facilities at this hotel, rooms. And we got there at 11:30, and that was because we'd been driving all night from the last job. Well, yeah, that's what we did. But anyway, we go into this hotel up these 3 or 4 steps, this big glass door. We go into the lobby. Big, huge guy sitting behind the desk, and there was a drunk in there, annoying this guy. It was 12 of us that went into the lobby to get our rooms. And the guy said, "Just a minute, I'll be with you in a minute," because this drunk was annoying this guy. And the guy kept saying, "You better leave me alone and get out of here." And he said, "I'm telling you to get the hell out of here." And this guy was so annoying. So the guy kept doing it. The guy behind the counter said, "I told you to get the hell out." He reached down, took out a gun, and shot him. 3 times. Bam, 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 knocked him through the glass door, down the stairs, into the gutter. Now we're standing there looking. Oh my God. And of course then the police came, and they're asking us questions. Well, he just shot him. I don't know what the argument was about. Long story short, we got these rooms, and nobody stayed in them. They all stayed in my room because we were all afraid.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, I mean we just out. To see a guy get shot, that's not a pleasant sight. So anyway, we all stayed in my room, stayed up all night talking. The producer Van called we were going to perform at Morehouse College. That was just on television the other day. We were going to perform there, and but now we don't have a hotel. So what they did was to arrange quarters for all 12 of us at Spelman College, which was a college right across the street. It's the all-girl college.
It's the women's college.
Women's
yes.
college.
Oh.
And I never forget, we stayed at the girls' quadrangle. That's what they called it. And they gave us all rooms and everything. But that was my experience. They shot this guy, blew him out the door, blood all over the place. Police comes, and that was my first experience in Atlanta, Georgia. One of the many. I mean, you know, my travels in the South and prejudice, I mean, that's the whole thing I could tell you about that was scary, frightening.
Oh my gosh.
You know. But it was not a happy night for all of us.
Kind of like the Green Book, the movie, but much worse.
Well, yeah, well, we knew where to stay.
Yes.
And sometimes it was never really sumptuous accommodation, all substandard, because we were doing a black tour.
Sure.
So, and if you're performing in the South, those were the accommodations. You know, they had made accommodation once for us, and then myself and one of the other guys had a reservation at a preacher's house. You know, and we went and again, it was 10:30, 11 o'clock at night when we got into town. And we knock on the door, we're from the traveling troupe, blah, blah, blah. The guy said, "Are you all showbiz, theater people?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well," he said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I got a 17-year-old daughter, and I just don't want that kind of environment in my house." And here we are, 11 o'clock at night, no place to stay, didn't know where to go, and we got turned out of this house. So I don't know what we did that night. We called Van, the producer, and we got some accommodation. We went to some hotel that cost us $2, and the door was not on the wall. The door was hanging off. The guy had nerve enough to say, and it'll cost you 50 cents extra if you want to bring a guest, mean a lady. No, we'll do without that. But I mean, it's just, I can go on and on with the miseries of touring in the South. Story in Jackson, Mississippi, when I was with Cab, where I got hit by Captain John. Big old band was playing, dance going on, and at that time, if you played a white dance, the black people could stay upstairs in the balcony and look down.
Oh, is that right?
And vice versa.
Right.
And I guess it was a white dance, because they were white people upstairs, black people downstairs. Anyway, we were standing at the door, the three of us, Paul, the other roadie, and Rudolph, his valet, and me, standing by the door. The dance is going on. And Captain John comes in, this big guy, he must have weighed 400 pounds, big old straw hat, a big gun belt with a big 45 and a blackjack. So he comes in and says, "Hey, boy," and the band is playing. We didn't pay too much attention to that. And I saw them coming up because I was looking in that direction. And he said, "Hey, boy." And so we turned around. He said, "Nigga, when I call you, you better turn around." So by this time, we're all three looking. And he reached down. I thought he was going to pull out his gun, pull out his blackjack. And he hit Paul right in the head, split his head wide open. Same, like hit him, hit me in the shoulder, and I fall down. And he swung at Rudolph. By this time, the place is mayhem. He came in with 2 or 3 other highway patrolmen. They're blowing the whistle. Of course, the band stops playing. People start screaming. He whistles, and he gets everybody's attention. Now, Paul is on the ground bleeding, and my shoulder's swelling up. And he's yelling, he said, "If any of you niggas here after 12 o'clock, you're going to be in my jail." And by that time, it was maybe 10:30, quarter to 11. Well, that ruined that evening, I'll tell you. But again, that's we finally got some help from Paul, because there was no hospital that would take black people. So we had to find somebody to give Paul, because he split his head open. It's the stitches in his head. So we had to find some medical. By that time, CAB had come down and called people and tried to get medical attention. So that was just one of the many experiences.
That was Jackson, Mississippi?
Jackson, Mississippi. I never will forget that. Never. But that was just one of the many.
Yeah.
One of the many. Fun life. But you know, you kind of pack up your bag and go on to the next job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what you did. And it wasn't a bad. Well, traveling with CAB, we always knew where we, and the Green Book was foreign to me in terms of that identification. We just knew where we were going.
You knew where you were going, yeah.
Yeah, because the booking agent made sure that Mr. Calloway had a proper hotel, and the band, you know. And being part of the band, we always had a hotel. Not sumptuous, but those hotels were better than the ones I did when I was grown and coming out of New York. See, that was a different era. That was years later.
Yeah.
And but I've never heard it referred to as the Green Book. Never.
Oh, really?
We used to say, where's the Indian Territory? Meaning any conclave or collection of people. As a joke, hey man, where's the Indian Territory? Meaning the black community.
Right.
Where's the black community? And that's how I recall the identification of the hotels and things, you know, the Indian Territory. But I'm sure that was a time, Don Shirley was after CAB.
I think that was the 60s. I think that was the early 60s.
That was years later.
Yeah, very early.
Yeah. And while there was still segregation.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't as bad as when I was down in the 40s.
Not in the 40s.
No, getting paid.
Without getting paid. Now, about this time, I mean, Bernie told me about this, that you had, you met among all these people that you were meeting, Walter Winchell? You had a
Walter Winchell, yes, that was one
the
of the,
gossip writer, or whatever you call him.
yes. He was a journalist.
He was a journalist.
World famous journalist, Walter
Yeah.
Winchell. We were playing Ciro's in Hollywood. That's a big famous nightclub. I was traveling with CAB. And it was one of the rare occasions when he would actually take me out with him to socialize. I was with the band, and I stayed with the band. My guys were all musician friends.
Sure.
But anyway, he took me to dinner with him, and with Walter Winchell and some other notary people. And we were sitting down, so I tried to engage in the conversation. And me being a hip young man from Chicago, I'm delving in that kind of hipster talk. Yeah, man, everything's cool.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm doing all that. And he just kind of looked at me, and he would ask me questions. I would do this jive talk. CAB was the instrument in development of that jive.
Correct.
And so he stopped me. He said, "Oh," he said, "how much schooling have you had?" I said, "Well, I went to high school." He said, "Well, if you learn how to speak the King's English," he said, "you'd make a much better presentation." He said, "You really need to go back to school." He said, "Because I think you are an intelligent young man." He said, "But I could never tell. I just shut up, ate my soup, and wished I could get out of there that particular moment." But that was my experience with, and that really hurt. That made me stop and think about my limitations.
Sure.
Because I could converse rather with the guys in the band and my own contemporaries, but to hold an intelligent conversation, apparently I wasn't able to do that. Not with any degree of success.
So to a degree that probably led you eventually to college, is that
Oh,
correct?
yeah, but that made me start thinking about school.
Sure.
But I was right in the middle of a tour, so it didn't make any difference. I
Sure.
put it right out of my mind.
But eventually you did.
Oh, sure, because when I got back home, CAB must have told my aunt about that, you know, and that was one of the main reasons that she insisted that I go to school or go back home.
Right.
So and I didn't particularly want to go back home because I wasn't doing anything of great
Right.
value there. And my uncle lived in a very sumptuous house and had all the amenities that I always dreamed of, you know. And,
Where'd you go to college?
my undergrad work was Morgan State, which is Morgan State University.
in
Baltimore.
in Baltimore, right?
Baltimore, yeah.
You know.
So
No, wait, I may be getting confused here, but right after your undergraduate, were you then inducted into the Army?
I was drafted.
You were drafted into the Army.
I was drafted 4 days after I graduated.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, I got my notice, and that kind of turned my life upside down.
Absolutely.
Did not want to go in the military.
Where were you in the Army? What did you serve, like in Korea?
Oh, yes. I did Korea, did that. An ugly experience, but I did it and
Yeah.
came back fortunately.
Was this during the time of the Korean?
Absolutely, it was during
Right.
the Korean War.
Wow.
I was drafted in 1951, went to Korea, came back in 1953. I was
53?
discharged, yeah.
And what'd you do after Korea?
After Korea, I was a young man with a young family, looking to find
Were you married at the time?
I was married.
Mhm.
I had my daughter, I had a daughter named Michelle. So when I came back, I was married, had a daughter named Michelle. I wanted to be in the entertainment world,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I had a lot of jobs when I first got out of the military, and construction work was the thing that I remember vividly because it was hard work. Probably paid better at that time than most jobs,
Sure.
although I had other kinds of silly jobs. You know, just searching to see what I wanted to do. Ran across a friend of mine who I went to high school with in Chicago, Louise Stubbs, and she was in theater. Bless her heart, she stayed. That's how she made her living. And I ran across her, and we said, well, you know, what are you doing about? She said, have you been doing any shows? I said, no. She said, would you like to join my troupe? I said, sure. She said, have you ever directed? Of course. So I said, not recently, lying. So she had this show that she was directing and needed somebody to assist her. Anyway, I got the job. And that's how I started in New York in theater. And that went on forever.
Yeah. You directing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I performed for many years before I started
Mm-hmm.
directing.
Were you also working at the time other jobs? I mean, were you in
Yeah.
your profession as a psychotherapist?
Well, not at that point.
Okay.
When I first came out of the service, I worked in construction. And I worked at a place called the Gotham Circulating Library. That was a hoot. Anyway, I won't even go into that. It was a silly job that didn't pay anything. It didn't pay much, and I didn't like the job, so I didn't keep that very long. But then I got this construction job, and that was hard work, but it paid good. And then from the construction job, I got this job in New York with Louis,
Mm-hmm.
barely making a living, struggling as an actor, off-Broadway things. And again, I was a good singer, and that was one of the reasons why Louise hired me, because I did have a good voice. And what she was doing was a musical review at the time. So I came in, did the show, then directed the show, and that started my career. But it didn't pay much.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really scuffling, trying to support my family, living in Yonkers, commuting to New York,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. So I knocked around New York for a number of years trying to make a living. It just didn't pay enough. I didn't make it. You ever hear of a guy by the name of Lou Gossett?
Lou Gossett? Yes.
Yeah, well, he and I did a couple of shows together where we were all trying to make it at the time, me and Lou Gossett. And the industry has been very good to Lou.
Yes, it has.
obviously, you know. So, but that's, I started in theater back then. And then one thing led to another, and when I decided that I was not making enough money, I had to look for another paying job. And also thinking about furthering my education, which I ultimately did. And I got a job at Children's Village, which is upstate in Dobbs Ferry, New York, working with delinquent kids from New York City. And that's where I got into putting my undergrad degree in psychology to work, because I work with disturbed kids.
I see.
And that led to my career as a psychotherapist, because I got a master's degree, and I kept developing my educational platform. And working, again, at Children's Village, and then from Children's Village, I worked there a number of years, and then I moved, I guess. We moved from Dobbs Ferry to Yonkers. And I've moved around a few times with my young family at the time.
Eventually you moved to Connecticut? Is that?
Eventually moved to Connecticut. Yes, we eventually moved to, lived in Yonkers for a while, and then we moved to Connecticut because my first wife at that time had lived in Connecticut as a child.
I see.
And she knew friends, and I had just finished grad school, and we were looking for a different job. I wanted to leave Children's Village because I'd been there 7 years.
I see.
And they had promised me a promotion. They didn't give it to me. I was thinking about going to Europe, special services, and I didn't do that. What did I do? We moved to Connecticut, and I got a job as a probation officer, which I really enjoyed.
Oh, did you?
I loved it. I loved it. And I worked for the juvenile court. And from the juvenile court, I guess I went into the school system. And then from the school system, I went into the Danbury Hospital as a therapist, because I had gotten a lot of other education during that period. And moved to Connecticut. By that time, I moved to Connecticut with my first wife and my daughter, and started working at the Danbury Hospital, where I eventually met Bernie.
Now, you were at the Danbury Hospital for years, weren't you?
Many years,
Yeah.
20 years, along with my private practice, concurrent with the private practice. And there's never been a time when I was not doing theater.
Well, I was about to get to that. Somehow you became involved with community theater in the Danbury area.
Absolutely.
How did that come about?
Oh gosh, that's such a long story.
Brief it up for us a little bit.
I lived in New Milford, which is 2 towns away from Danbury. They had not had any theater in that town.
I see.
And I met somebody who was interested in bringing theater to that town. That's where I eventually bought a theater and owned my own theater.
Did you?
In New Milford. Still working at the hospital. So I bought this theater, started a theater group. A partner of mine, Harry Cohen, and I bought this theater, a church.
Did you? It was a church?
An old Seventh-day Adventist church. And we bought this church and started a theater, which was unknown to that area, because by that time I had had years of been in theater and directing and all that stuff. So we opened that theater there, and it's still in existence now. But I went from that theater to 2 or 3 other theaters in the same area as a director. And
how many shows did you produce or direct a year? It must have been a lot of them.
I can't.
And you had your regular job too.
Every day I went and shrunk somebody's head. Every day.
And then at night you would help them learn lines, I suppose.
Went from my office to the rehearsal, and that went on for years. And
do you have any favorite shows that you did then? I mean, that's probably asking an unfair question.
No, it isn't, because my all-time favorite show is West Side Story.
West Side Story.
All-time favorite. I directed and I was in it. But I got labeled as a guy that could do only musicals, and that was not so. I used to get tired of doing musicals. I can't tell you how many I've done. But I do like drama and comedy.
Sure.
Which I do hopefully as well as I do musicals.
Did you always know that you could be a director? I mean, was that natural for you, or
Natural.
was it?
It was, because Louise asked me, could I direct, and I said, yeah.
Even though you had never directed?
Never.
Isn't that so?
I just thought I could do that, because I was always a people person. I was a people person in college, people person on the road with Cab, people person as a singer, a young singer with a group. People have always been my forte, if you will.
Well, basically, your work, too, away from the theater. You were a people person.
People person.
Basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've had a good life.
Yeah. You told me some wonderful stories about starting theater after you'd been involved in theater in the Connecticut area, taking it outside and doing Shakespeare, sort of Shakespeare in the Park, I guess.
Shakespeare? No, you don't guess. I did Shakespeare in the Park.
Really?
That happened in Pauling, New York, which is right across the line from Connecticut.
I see.
There was an outdoor theater, a Shakespearean company, professional company. And I went, curious, and Midsummer Night Dream was the first show that I saw. And I'm saying, Jesus, I could do that. And that started it. And it was all outside in the outside yard or whatever. So I went back to Danbury. Danbury.
Yeah.
And that idea just burned in my mind, because I was already doing theater. I was doing my theater in New Milford. And I said, so I had never done a Shakespearean play to that point, and I'd done so many other shows.
Sure.
So why not Shakespeare?
Why not?
So I went to Danbury. I worked in Danbury. I had a friend of mine, June Goodman, who was a pretty influential person in the Danbury area, and a creative person, and a supporter of the theater, because she's the one that got me to be a commissioner of the arts for the state of Danbury. And that's a whole nother story. I was commissioner, 12 commissioners, and I was one of them. Mm-hmm. And we supplied grants to all the professional theaters, the Long Walk, every theater, Hartford Symphony, Hartford Ballet, all of the professional theaters sent us grants for us to support them, and we did. And I was one of them. Now I'm getting ahead of myself.
That's okay.
Story. And that was 4 years, and that appointment was coterminous with the governor at the time. That was El Grasso. But we were invited to all the opening nights, all of the parties, anything that was quality theater in the state of Connecticut, we were invited to, because they all wanted us to support them.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
And we had these monthly meetings with all 12 commissioners. So anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. June Goodman was the chair of that committee. And when I wanted to do Shakespeare in Danbury, she was excited. And she took me to Richter Park, which is one of the 10 best golf courses in the country.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Stanley Richter had this mansion on this property. And when he died, he donated it to the city. And they made a golf course out of it. But the back of the house, the main house, was a huge expanse, like a half an acre, an acre.
Sure.
Of just open ground. It used to be a pool, but they filled it in. So it took me there, and I said, this is the spot for me to do Shakespeare in the Park. And it was a big open space with woods all around. And I put the audience in the open space and lit the woods. And my actors came out of the trees.
Oh.
That was an experience there that you would have loved.
I would have loved to have seen that.
And I did that for 6 years, concurrent with me working full-time and my other theater. I did all of that.
Yeah.
Because I was
now,
young.
while you were, obviously you were well known for your theater work.
Absolutely.
And you were established at the hospital.
Absolutely.
And you had a knock on the door or a phone ring, and a fairly well-known Hollywood type of actor who also lived in Connecticut wanted your help on a project.
Paul Newman.
Paul Newman.
And I was at the clinic at my office with a patient, and my secretary buzzed me, which is a no-no. You don't buzz a therapist when he's in the middle of a session. And I'm saying, oh my God, what is it? She said, there's a man here saying, there's a phone call from Paul Newman. I said, you're going to play a game with me when I'm in the middle? And I hung up the phone. So she called back, she said, I'm not kidding. So long story short, I picked up the phone, and it was Stark, Robert Stark, which is his producer. And he's calling in for Paul and blah, blah, wants to know if he can come and see me. And I'm thinking somebody's playing a joke on me.
Yeah.
Long story short, it was not a joke. Paul Newman came to see me the next week in my office at the hospital. And because they were one of the big scenes in Rachel, which is the movie that they made, that I was in, took place in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And he came over. He said, well, I'm going to be in town on Saturday morning. Could I see you? I said, fine, come to my office. So he came and sat in my office for well over an hour, and I arranged that shoot for the hospital because one of the characters in that movie was in the hospital. And I arranged the whole shoot with the publicity department, everybody.
Was he enjoyable to work with?
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole nother story. You know, whatever directing techniques I might have acquired is because of him.
Sure.
And how to treat people, you know, and that's a whole nother story I'd have to tell you.
You acted in the movie, didn't you?
I was in that movie.
Yeah.
You can still see that movie. In fact, I'll let you see my copy of that movie.
What was your role?
I played a preacher in a tabernacle, a place where the community came to do services. And I had lines with Joanne Woodward and Estelle Parsons.
Oh.
And I had a big scene closing the doors, big close-up of me closing the door. That's a whole nother story. Got paid, got residuals for years after that.
Did Mr. Newman, what did he think of your work?
He was a great guy. He was a great guy. Well, he did not think good of it because he kept me in the film.
Sure.
No, he thanked me, gave me a big picture, which I have, autographed. Like I say, I got residuals for a few years. Got in the union, you know. That was quite an experience,
We've covered a lot of territory here.
Thank you.
I mean, we have New Orleans, we've got Chicago, we have you on the road with cab, going to college, all those experiences, then Connecticut, and now Sun City. I mean, it was kind of nice for you to move down here. How did you get to Sun City?
A friend of mine in Connecticut who lives here, who just moved from here, Jan Dow. Did you know Jan Dow?
Yes, she, a playwright.
Playwright.
Yes.
Jan did a project with me. I had a project called, I can't think of it. Anyway,
No problem.
a project where we invited new playwrights to come and present their plays.
Mm-hmm.
I would provide the actors and we'd do the play and then critique it, but the author had to be there. Long story short, that went on for 3 years, was very successful. Jan moved down here, and I was about to retire at the time, and so was Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
And said, you ought to come down and visit Sun City. South Carolina? You gotta be kidding me. So anyway, we did come down. Long story short, we did come down, and we saw a play they were doing here, because that was one of the considerations. I really needed to be involved in theater.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah. Came down here, and they were doing a play called A Moss Heart Thing. Most god-awful thing I've ever seen. God-awful.
Was it at Pinckney Hall?
No, yes, it was at Pinckney.
Yeah.
Anyway, long story short, but my thought was they do need help, you know. And I wrote a letter of introduction to Bob Taylor, and he, lovely man that he is.
Yes.
He invited me down. We were coming back down to, again, review our house plans. And he gave a party for me, as he's wont to do. And I met, at the time, the Nussbaums and that sort of thing. And anyway, she was about to do My Fair Lady, which I had done.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the shows I've done here, I've done before.
I see.
All of these shows were not new to me. Fun. So anyway, I said, yes, I'd co-direct with you, which I had done once and will never do again. So we did My Fair Lady, and it was a big success.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, we did it at the high school.
Right.
And I guess you say the rest is history, because from that point I did 6 or 8 shows after that, until my last show, which was spam a lot.
Mhm.
So, but
Well,
Sunset,
I was fortunate to work for you in a couple of shows, and
Yes, you were.
You taught me so much.
bless your heart.
But I just want to ask you, I mean, I kind of wrap this up here now.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of territory. Any thoughts or ideas for, say, if you have young relatives who are watching this, any thoughts or ideas about, I'm taking you to a different area, about
Yeah.
life and how you succeed and how you have to work hard and,
Well, I think you just said it. Succeed in working hard means attitude, preparation, and education. And all of my kids and all of my grandkids, fortunately, have attained most of that. All of my kids are educated. My grandchildren are coming up in a firm educational environment. All of our kids are successful, and all of their kids are grounded with an educational enforcement and encouragement. And I'm lucky to this day that all of these kids are doing well, and I can only tell them how important it is to continue growing, continue being honest.
it's quite a life that you've lived, Wendell MacNeal, and you're still living it and marching on, but gosh, a long way you have come, and the world has changed. Hopefully, maybe not enough, but it's changed somewhat. Anyway, I hope
It has.
headed in the right direction.
I certainly hope so, and it gives me thought, concern at this point in terms of the direction, but I won't get into the politics.
No.
But anyway, to everybody I say, live your life, love your life, and please, please, be honest. That's all I can say.
Thank you.